how many times on this program have we told you Washington is a supposedly progressive state with America's most regressive tax system? We don't tax people on their high incomes. Our Constitution doesn't allow an income tax. Well, this morning, as we record this Friday, this morning, our state Supreme Court ruled that the new capital gains tax passed by the legislature is allowed. Melissa, our state attorney general called this the most progressive change in Washington tax policy in generations. True?
I mean, that's true because they haven't really done much for the past,
that's why we've been
years.
saying it for years.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true because it does mean if you're selling a lot of stock or whatever over a certain amount, over $250,000 in profit in a year, you have to pay taxes on that.
Yeah. So for those listeners who haven't been following this, briefly, what is this capital gains tax? Who pays and why?
They estimate that it's a really small percentage. I think they think it's under like 1% of people will pay it. But those estimates come from maybe Department of Revenue. But basically, it's if you sell a bunch of assets, this is like stocks. It could be like expensive artwork. I have a lot of that at home. I don't know if they're sure you do.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's a breathtaking.
Right. And then if you sell that and gain profit from it, you have to pay some tax on that. And that's only if you get more than $250,000 in a year from that. And
okay, one more question for you, then I'll open it up further. This capital gains tax, as I said, passed a couple of years ago by the legislature, has been challenged in court, called unconstitutional, called an income tax. Why did this court rule 7-2 in favor of the capital gains tax?
Well, they really sided with the state on this. And the state has argued all along, and the legislature, I mean, at least the Democrats in the legislature said it's an excise tax. So basically they're saying it's like a sales tax kind of thing, like it's a sale on a transaction. This isn't an income
because you
tax.
have to sell something to have capital gains.
And the majority said, yep, this whole, all of our provisions in the Constitution regarding, income taxes, and you can't tax one group higher than another. Those don't apply because this isn't a property tax. It gets into some weeds there with some old precedents, but basically not a property tax, not income tax, doesn't apply.
I was struck by that this did not immediately open the door to an income tax, but the justices and the way they wrote it made it clear that they would probably welcome one. There was a very long section of the opinion that went deep in the history of taxation policy, and it kind of cast some shade on previous Supreme Court rulings. It basically kind of summarized as things change. We had the 1930s era Supreme Court ruling that really set the benchmark standard for taxation of income is property, and there's a limit under the state constitution about of uniformity of taxation of property. So this one, you
can't tax people with a lot of it and not tax most people, at all. You can't do that.
You're explaining it better than I did. Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, and the whole point of income taxes is you do tax people at different incomes levels differently. So
what about a flat tax?
I know there's a 1% cap on property increases. So I don't know. I'm not a tax expert. I would not pretend to play one, but I did notice the politics of this ruling was also interesting in that it was kind of an unusual ruling with a lot of value judgments, had a legislating from the bench kind of feel that we hear a lot about the U.S. Supreme Court, frankly, right now, but this is legislating from the left. It used the words regrettable tax policy. There's one line I flagged that Washington's upside down tax system perpetuates systemic racism by placing disproportionate tax burden on BIPOC residents.
Right. And whether you agree with that or not, that's separate. That seems separate from whether it's an income tax or an excise tax.
It reads more like a political statement and less like a judicial one.
At the same time, I was a little, I was struck that they didn't go farther, like you said in the beginning. Like the opponents of this tax had been saying it's an unconstitutional income tax. Here's why. Under this 1930s court ruling, they just left that 1930s tax court ruling alone.
Yeah.
Because they could have said, no, we don't think that, getting in the weeds again, but income is property. And we don't think that. They could have just kind of been like, we overturned that decision.
Yeah, income tax is cool.
Yeah, exactly. And they did not do that. So I think they were kind of straddling a line there in a way, despite all that stuff that was in there. And so some progressives would have wanted more, I think, from this.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is the reason we're here, to the point that you just made, is because nearly 100 years ago, there was another decision in the 1930s. And Sorry for listeners when things get like so wonky in stories like this. I always feel bad covering them, but it really does go back to 1930s, a decision that said income is property. And ever since then, Washington has been layering and layering and layering laws. So other points that we have to point out, you can only cap taxes on property at 1%. The grand solution to this would be to go and fix the Constitution and just go to the source. That's a lot harder to do than what we're doing right now, which is why we're here, kind of doing some legal finagling to get around and make a capital gains tax.
There's also a political problem in that Washingtonians have rejected, coming up to an income tax. Income tax is not popular
multiple
as a ballot
times.
issue. Yeah, it's not. So it's interesting in progressive Seattle and maybe King County and progressive circles, this feels like a no-brainer. If your goal is to have a tax policy that is healthy and robust and also more equitable, but I don't know I'd be interested to see what the polling would look like on an income tax again. I thought that the capital gains tax was more, even though it's, the argument has been it's a camel's nose under the tent, that it's more popular than an income tax.
Do you feel that Arizona is about to get 7,000 more residents at this point?
Right.
Or Texas or Florida?
That's the argument. The opponents are saying, well, say goodbye to people who have capital gains above $250,000 because they don't want to be in Washington anymore. Do we think that's true?
I think I understand the logic behind that argument because let's be honest here. Aside from Melissa's artwork that she has at home, if you're dealing with profits over $250,000 in stocks and bonds, you're just living in a differment reality.
And by the way, and more so because this law exempts sales through your retirement accounts. It exempts property sales, home sales.
Exactly. But if you're in that arena of profits on stocks and bonds, I could see a lot of, jumping and skipping. Oh yeah, I'll just put my residency at my summer home in X state or something.
And there's a lot of, Washington is only one of like a handful. I don't know. I think 5 states that don't have an income tax. And a lot of other states that don't have an income tax do have a capital gains tax. And then you have a state like California where that has a very high income tax and a very high capital gains tax. So Texas is obviously the one that, Texas and I think Boise are the 2 places I've heard people moving for tax reasons. But, Washington is still, even with this, is a very favorable state if you're very rich.
Okay, should we put a pause there? And one final question that Dyer asked is, could this go to the U.S. Supreme Court? Which you might think, well, that's a Washington state issue, but it could be seen as an international or an interstate commerce issue.
If I was a lot smarter, I would know the answer to that question. I really would like to pick the brain of a lawyer, but it's because if it's the sale of an asset, your bank could be in New York, exactly,
and you're here.
Which was part of the lawsuit, is saying that this violates some interstate policies and laws. In which case, I don't know, the stage for that going to the U.S. Supreme Court with the court that we have now, and the fact that every other state in the United States plus the IRS says capital gains is income.
Yes,
I don't know how that would turn out.
Yeah. Okay. We'll see what happens next on the capital gains tax, but it's being implemented for now, as in this year's by the April tax deadline. They're going to try to. It's in the budget.
Yeah, I think they're banking the revenue for this.
Yeah, they had the law never was put on pause during this entire case, and so there's going to be payments coming in next month on this from people.
$500 million a year, something like that.
Yeah.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money
for schools.
Okay, let's talk about KUOW's Week in Review here. And we have another, this is a federal court ruling to discuss. This is about the rights of Seattle home renters and the rules that Seattle can impose on landlords. So a few years ago, the Seattle City Council prohibited landlords from asking about a prospective tenant's criminal history and banned landlords from denying someone a home solely based on their criminal record. Well, landlords sued, saying they have a legitimate interest in a tenant's criminal past and a free speech right to ask them about it. This week, the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with half of that. Who wants to start us on this court ruling?
I could throw something out there because I feel like it reflects my feelings on this, and it's kind of a wash in a way. I'm not sure if anything's really going to change in Seattle as a result of this. It basically comes down to you can ask about a potential tenant's previous criminal record. However, you cannot use a previous criminal record in your decision making to rent them.
Right.
So I don't know where that leaves any landlord out there in Seattle in their decision making. So it kind of knocks down Seattle's law, but kind of does not.
I find it curious. There is similar legislation to this in called ban the box, which in for employment purposes. So you can't ask somebody about their criminal record until a certain point in the employment process. You can run somebody's criminal history, I think, after you get past initial screening. And I was interesting here. There was a kind of the ordinance was written as a blanket ban. You can't talk about criminal history at all. So it was interesting to let the city council could have just basically cut and pasted out of the state law or the city ban the box legislation as well, in an approach that had already been withstood judicial review. And I think that kind of goes to some of the criticisms about the city council, in that landlords have said they're uncertain where the council is going to go next. That uncertainty then drives people out of the market. The criticism of the city council legislating with ideology and not practicality in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Can I throw something out there as a question? Because you say practicality in mind, and this is an observation I've made about our Seattle city councils. It seems that a lot of stuff that passes through Seattle, we pass X bill, and then inevitably a lawsuit is filed, and then maybe that thing stands, maybe half of the law stands. Is this just kind of the way of Seattle doing business? Just do something, and then we'll just see how it works in the court?
I think kind of, yeah. I think they do try and test the court a lot. Like they did that with the high earners tax actually recently. Yeah. That the ruling kind of came back halfway. They said, no, you can't, you could apply a flat tax that's 1% to everybody, but you can't do it this way. You can't just like impose it just on the wealthy people. So they do try that quite a bit. And I think that the state actually watches that and says, so it's like a test ground. And I think there's some collaboration in there actually between liberals sort of in the state to see if Seattle's policy will pass muster. Yeah, what happens then?
I remember back in the day, there was a ban on firearms in parks, which violated the state's preemption clause for firearm legislation. And also we've done all kinds of stuff with election campaign finance and support and like democracy vouchers that goes to the court. Yeah. It is kind of a playground, testing ground for progressive policy.
That's the 9th city council member, the court.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, like the 5th Beatle. Okay, so from a legal perspective, the landlord said the First Amendment protects their right to ask questions relevant to their livelihoods. So if knowing whether someone has a criminal record is relevant to their livelihood, why can't they base their rental decision on it?
There's an anti-discrimination provision. I think I think that possibly the fear is, okay, you can't legally do anything with this information, but does it cloud somehow your decision making anyway? I think there must be some sort of concern in the background there, because legally it doesn't really like change anything in a way, because you still can't use the information. Yeah. But it was a free speech issue. They said that you can't ban people from asking stuff and talking about stuff, in that way. But maybe there's a fear that it still kind of influence decisions if they are asked about it, even if they're not allowed to use the information.
The backdrop here is landlord frustration with Seattle imposing some of those restrictions. And our housing reporter, Joshua McNichols, reported that it is hard to draw a direct line, because some landlords, they'll say, we have all got an exit strategy. We're dropping out of the market. It doesn't make sense for us. And that's not good for renters. And Joshua reported that although it's hard to pin down direct reasons for these things, it's true that Seattle's landlord scene by the numbers has gotten, he says, distinctly less mom and pop and a lot more corporate.
Yeah, it was really interesting reporting by Josh. The number of people that had left the landlords that had left the market, and the ones and were equal to the new units coming on, which was kind of fascinating. I think again, going to the kind of the breadth of the approach of the background check ordinance, and I mentioned before, this is the kind of thing that makes landlords concerned, like what's going to happen next. There's, as part of this same criminal background check ordinance, there's also a first in line element that my friends who are landlords said was just crazy for them, because if somebody met criteria, they would have to take the first person in line. And I think it causes chaos for people trying to rent too.
I was getting up early doing calisthenics just to get there first.
Yeah.
But that's why looking at the thing from the landlord's point of view, you said some of it you think is maybe bad for renters too, but there's plenty of reason why that,
Sure.
Who's got the power in this?
Well, there's certainly a ton
equation.
of protections for eviction
Yes.
protections and like rent stability. You can have only a certain amount of, I believe, a certain amount of rent increase a year now.
Yeah.
As moving assistance, if your landlord ups and decides to sell. A lot of protections for renters that are new, which I can appreciate as a city. It's half renters now.
Yeah, right.
There's a good reason for it.
One more thing before we take a break. Did you know there's a movement among not all, but many landlords to call themselves housing providers instead? Roger Valdez, director for Seattle for Growth, said the term landlord sounds archaic, feudal, like something out of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and it doesn't reflect the partnership that can be between tenant and housing provider. You're all journalists. Do you use landlord or housing provider? Would you switch?
I use landlord just because no one knows what the heck they're talking about. If you say housing
Yeah.
provider, the only time I do that, if it's like a nonprofit that's building affordable housing, sometimes I'll say housing provider if it's like a really large group. But if it's like someone who owns a building who's renting it or someone renting out their townhome, like I still use landlord just for clarity, because you don't have to spend two sentences explaining what you're talking about.
So it's not because providers suggest you're doing it out of the goodness of your
I mean,
heart, whereas lord suggests you've got all the power.
I mean, some
Lord.
words are just words we've used historically
Yeah.
a certain
Yeah.
way. And it's like, sometimes we need to reevaluate those words, but I'm not sure landlord is one of those exactly.
Mortgage meant death pledge. So
Oh yeah, mortality, mortgage.
Yeah,
Wow.
That's a good one. I didn't
words,
realize.
I think words should probably evolve more naturally. Landlord is not really keeping me up at night. And I mean, this is saying as someone who is millennial-ish in the Seattle area, ergo, I don't own anything. I
Uh-huh.
rent. And I've never felt too lordly renting in Seattle. So the term fits for me.
You've never felt renting.
Renting.
You have never felt lordly.
No, the landlord clearly held that position. with me.
Yes. Okay. Well, I do. There is some interesting back and forth about this. In fact, Joshua, again, our housing reporter, talked to a local housing provider, their preferred term, and she said a grocer charges money for food. We don't call them a food lord.
That's true.
And should we refer to people however they want to be referred to? Yeah.
I think we could come up with a
Right?
better term, because there's a bunch of parents out there that are like, I guess we're housing providers now, you know, putting that out there.
Well, I do a series every Monday in this podcast feed, in the Week in Review feed, called Words in Review. I've looked into iconic, legendary dive bar exodus. So I'm asking you, listener, landlord or housing provider or something else, and why? Email me at bradke@kuow.org. That's BRADKE at KUOW.org, because I'm the email lord, apparently, who reads those and makes those powerful decisions. And we'll have a next Words in Review coming up on Monday. Let's take a break. We've got more to talk about, like maybe no light rail hub in the heart of Chinatown. We'll be right back.
It's Week in Review on 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. 12:26, currently 45 degrees in Seattle. We are expecting rain today and a high of 48.
Hi, I'm Chris Morgan, an ecologist, conservationist, and host of KUOW's The Wild podcast. I believe wildlife is teaching us some of the most important lessons of our time. And on The Wild, our stories are more than just science. They're about heart, and why so many people are working so hard to save our wild ecosystems. Listen to inspiring stories about our natural world with new episodes of The Wild, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Support for KUOW comes from Cambium Landscapes. Since 1998, working with clients' tastes and home architecture to create landscapes that complement their outdoor lifestyles, whether relaxing in the spa, dining al fresco, or playing pickleball. Photos, reels, and more info on Instagram at Cambium Landscape.
It's KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke, and our journalist panel this week is KUOW's online editor, Dyer Oxley, Axios Seattle reporter, Melissa Santos, Seattle Times investigations editor, Jonathan Martin. More big news to pass on. Sound Transit is deciding where to put its new transit hub, light rail hub, to link up the future line to West Seattle and Ballard. A lot of people who live and work in Chinatown International District objected to another station there. Last night, the Sound Transit Board voted 15-1 in favor of a station outside the ID, maybe two of them. It's not a final vote, but what is most important about this?
I think the question of, communities of color have had a lot of impacts that are negative from transportation in the past, from building freeways, from in this case, there's been construction projects in the Chinatown International District, and there's people bristling at, hey, wait, our businesses are going to have to be inconvenienced for another 10 years by another construction project. Mm-hmm. And so that's a concern that, for instance, the mayor has expressed a lot. But then the other side is it's like, well, maybe building in a different spot could make the entire system less convenient for riders forever, So balancing those, I think, is difficult. Balancing those concerns is difficult, and that's what they're grappling with right now.
Yeah, if you were just designing purely for efficiency, you would put it at Union Station, right? You've got the one line station there. You've got the Sounder train, Amtrak, streetcar, the buses. You don't make East Side riders backtrack to get where they're going. It would be Grand Central Station, so you'll be very crowded, and once again, you'd be tearing up the International District.
There's two things that loom over this. One, it was interesting. Bruce Harrell talked in a very personal level about how his family had businesses in the Chinatown International District. It was really really reflected the sentiment of that community, which is oftentimes really overlooked and has in the pandemic really made a lot of noise about how it was being neglected. The other thing is, it seems like every decision Sound Transit makes is the most expensive possible one.
Two stations.
So they're going to do two stations. One at the Pioneer Square, and then probably one south of there. We're also talking about now tunneling to Ballard, tunneling to West Seattle. It's just everything Sound Transit does is just like maximum cost, and you wonder how it all happens. I trust my colleague Mike Lindblom at the Seattle Times to break this stuff down, but it makes me just wonder how much more this is going to cost.
Well, and that's why I think this is not really a final, besides it not being a final vote, like I do think this could change again if the cost estimates come in like so high that it's like, we got to go back to voters for more money or something. That could really affect and be like the decision that's ultimately made. It also reminds me, this is me dating myself, but of the viaduct discussions like 15 years ago. It's like, I feel like there were stories written like, no tunnel, there's no tunnel, the tunnel's dead. I even wrote one of them, I think. And then we're going to do an elevated highway again, just a replacement or a surface. And then we have a tunnel now, right?
Yeah, I've ridden in that dead tunnel.
Right. I mean, we have a tunnel now after all. So it could be one of those things where it vacillates back and forth a few more times.
I gotta say, my sympathies, I've always kind of understood the voices coming out of the CID, because I'm one of the grumpy voices that critiques Seattle for the fact that we kind of don't really preserve a lot of anything, and everything going up new is sorry, not sorry. It's a little ugly. So I'm one of those voices, and you can't really deny that neighborhood in particular has a very specific historical personality. It's got a history there, and it has kept itself close knit throughout the decades. I'm not sure we could say that about many other neighborhoods in Seattle, some, maybe not all. And I just previously lived in Roosevelt while that station was going up, and it is a disruption to your neighborhood, and you have a big fence that's walling it off. It looks great now, and there's a lot more foot traffic now, but I gotta say, yeah, I kind of get the logic and the argument of, if you plant this in the middle of our community, it could shake things up. I understand that fear, I guess I should say.
One of the challenges of the regional transit system, I mentioned everything seems to be the most expensive version. You heard, the Snohomish County Executive and the Pierce County Executive, who are both on the board and looking at making sure that the lines get all the way down to north and south as were promised. I think that that's one of the challenges for Sound Transit, is to making sure that, the promises made, promises kept for the scope of the system, even as they're having these sort of individual level kind of turf wars and complicated political discussions.
Yeah, do what you're going to do, but don't spend all your money in Seattle.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
With nothing left for us. Okay, so as we said, not a final decision, just a leaning, maybe. So we'll see what happens next with this. That's a fascinating Sound Transit conundrum. And speaking of how we get around, one more item before we take another break. The city of Seattle this week reported that its new automated cameras caught drivers getting around illegally in Seattle bus lanes more than 110,000 times last year, including, see my list here, Melissa Santos and Jonathan Martin's kid.
So that's bad. I should not have been in a bus lane. I will say that it is a kind of staggering number of people who have been in the bus lanes, because this is only 5 places where they're monitoring this. It's not every single spot in every bus lane. In my defense, I will say that the camera on Aurora and Gaylor Street, which catches the most people, is like right as the bus lane ends. So it's kind of easy to get in there if you're trying to take a right turn coming up and you forget where the roads are, like I do.
So you're saying you got in a little early.
I got
just
in a
to
little
play
early.
It safe. I know where I want to be. There's no bus around me.
Yeah, but you shouldn't be in the bus lane. So I'm not going to I got a warning. I haven't done it a bunch of times. You get a warning the first time you do it. So I'm warned.
Do they take into, so when they're deciding, is it just, well, you get one warning and the next time a ticket, or is someone making a human judgment? Well, there was no buses around and I could see why she would do this. That's not egregious.
Theoretically, there is like a human element, like that goes through the police department. Like it's not just an auto stamp, but I don't think they're looking with that granularity at this at all, especially because it's not like even a right turn situation where you're kind of stopped and it's like you're in the bus lane or you're not. So I don't think they're probably giving people a dispensation like that.
That sounds right.
I'm with you in if I heard you correctly. I find those bus lanes a little confusing, and I feel like they're banking on that confusion as
yes.
You can't take right turns from the bus lanes. So you're allowed to take right turns.
Are you saying it's a money-making scheme?
Well,
to confuse us?
I do feel it's hard not to feel that sometimes when they set up these camera programs, they're a little predatory in a way. And I have mixed feelings. On one hand, bus lanes like this are where I want the city to move. I want there to be more bus capacity in the city. On the other hand, I don't know how I feel of depending on people to commit crimes in order to fund transportation. They made over $800,000 between March and December of last year. Half goes to the state, half goes to the city. And they use that for transportation funding. It goes into those sin tax debates that we have. We got all this money because people are drinking really unhealthy, sugary beverages, but we're buying healthy food because of it. We got all this transportation money, but people have to commit a violation just to even get there. So
you know who agreed with you? Tim Eyman. Tim Eyman took a hard run.
No, don't do this to me.
I wonder if it makes sense to do it during rush hour times, like certain hours of the day, because I think there are people who maybe zoom in the bus lane, see an open zone and go for it when it is a real problem and is going to delay a lot of people trying to use public transportation. And that's bad for the system. But at 11, I don't think there's an hours distinction.
We could
9 in the morning, 9 in the morning on a Saturday when there was no one around, I don't know. So maybe there's some nuance they could do there. They're also looking at how many people from out of Seattle are getting these tickets. That's part of what report they're going to do, because maybe it's just people who are like, I don't know. I'm in downtown Seattle. I don't know. And that's part of it. Maybe they're not the residents.
On my way in this morning, I saw somebody with the Vancouver or the BC plates just strolling down the bus lane. Oh, that's not going to end well for you.
Well, Seattle's not alone in this. I mean, it's not the same, but they do have similar bus lanes out in Bellevue, and I found myself in similar confusion in those times, especially when it comes to those turns. I don't know when I'm supposed to get in.
The one on 4th Avenue where it's only a block long in front of Westlake Park. It's requires you to do the slalom turn. It's it's absolutely. But one thing I wanted to reading this piece by Melissa, I was reminded of my colleague Danny Westneat did a column recently about the lack of traffic enforcement overall in Seattle in the pandemic. And he had an interesting stat that it was 40,000 tickets were given out annually in the 2010s. And in the 2022, it was 3,800. And I don't know about you, but I don't know how much anybody drives, but I feel like an old man now, but like I feel like traffic's getting worse. Like the traffic drivers are getting worse. People are like absolutely bonkers.
Well, and that's why I think there's people using the bus lanes in a way that's really not good. So like, I wouldn't be like, no cameras, it infringes our privacy necessarily. Cause it's like, well, stay out of the bus lane.
Well,
right?
do we know whether since they've gone, you get a warning and then you get a ticket as these 110,000 violations, as the city's been ticketing more, is it reducing the bus lane violations?
I don't think we quite have the data quite yet on that, because I was asking the same question when writing the story. I think they are looking to see if it declines over time. They did say that they will look at that as sort of an evidence of changing behavior, but I think we need a couple more years of data to see a little bit.
Anecdotally, I just, back up your statement about whether people are driving worse or better. I think there's something to be said that I don't know what it was about the pandemic. And again, anecdotal. Yeah, I think there have been some lax driving habits going on out on the road. Every time I drive in to the office, I see at least one road rage chase going on the freeway.
Yikes.
And yeah, I mean, it gets scary out there. And then, there are a lot of folks just making weird
pedestrian deaths are clearly up. It's like,
I don't know what it is. I mean, if you have thoughts, email Bill.
I'll forward them to Dyer, Oxley,
Great.
Today So Far blog. Okay, let us pause there. We are going to take a break, and we have brought up, in a way, this next issue in a couple of ways, talking about what we save, the history we preserve and don't preserve. We're going to talk about a decrepit memorial when we come back on Week in Review.
Support for KUOW comes from the UW's Population Health Initiative, created to address the intersecting factors that impact well-being, such as poverty, access to healthcare, and systemic inequities, working to transform research into action. uw.edu/population health.
I'm Julian Marshall, host of BBC News Hour. On today's program, Rahul Gandhi, a senior leader of India's opposition Congress party, has been expelled from parliament after a defamation conviction. And the governor of Utah tells us why his is the first American state to require parental permission for under 18s to use social media platforms.
Thank you, Julian. That's BBC NewsHour this afternoon at 1 o'clock, right after Week in Review on 94.9 KUOW.
Support for KUOW comes from Maxwell Graham, personal injury attorneys providing dedicated advocacy for clients who may have experienced negligence, assisting other attorneys with complex litigation. More information at maxwellgraham.com.
Phew, we may be red in the face when you go to YouTube or Facebook and stream this program. We're doing Week in Review, and we've got a lot to tell you about this week. I'm here with Axios Seattle reporter Melissa Santos, Seattle Times investigations editor Jonathan Martin, and KUOW online editor and producer Dyer Oxley. And this week, the city of Seattle and Seattle Public Schools announced they're looking to tear down and replace Memorial Stadium at Seattle Center. They're looking for a private partner to invest, design, build, operate, maintain, and manage it. Jonathan, Memorial Stadium is homely, but it works. I've seen concerts and soccer games there. Graduations happen there. Why?
Yeah, I don't want to ugly shame the stadium.
Okay,
but the discussion about replacing it has gone back to apparently the 60s. There's been at least the last 3 mayors have signed partnership deals with Seattle Public Schools to replace or redevelop it. And the city clearly wants to replace it. A former Seattle Center director called it a gap, a missing tooth in the smile of the Seattle Center. But the one of the hiccups, I believe, has been that it's been kind of yoked to for Seattle Schools, which owns the stadium, wants a downtown school. And so there's been a kind of a marriage of these two interests: Seattle Center wanting to fill the missing tooth, and the Seattle School District wanting to have an elementary school downtown where there's been so much growth in residential population.
So there would be a school where the stadium is?
No, the agreement signed by Durkin for replacing, you said one of these, a chain of agreements, gave the Seattle School District a rights to the Battery Street Tunnel North entrance. Remember when they took the Battery Street Tunnel down? There's a big chunk of land there in Belltown.
In Belltown, yes.
That's apparently big enough for a pretty good sized school. And the Seattle School District has rights there through, I believe, 2031.
Okay.
But I think that's been one of the challenges in getting something that everybody agrees it's not a great functional stadium. It's like kind of walls off part of the Seattle Center in a weird way. If you've been kind of over by the Mopop Museum and trying to get in there, it's just not a very great facility. So that's been I think one of the challenges in getting that replaced.
Well, what about, is this supposed to bring in more money for the children in some way? This private partner designed, built, enhanced?
Well, I think that's part of the RFP process, is to see what kind of partners will come to the table. I think, as putting on my investigations editor hat, I'd want to make sure that the subsidies for a public-private partnership don't all fly to the private side and not the public side.
Right.
It's a prime piece of property. Presumably, they're going to be able to, I think they're going to get, part of the deal is they're going to have naming rights, private naming rights, that I believe would go to the private developer. So there's money on the table. Obviously, next door, the Oakview Group just redeveloped the Climate Pledge Arena, and it's a beautiful facility and very, very successful. So there are people apparently very interested in this site, but I want to make sure that, to answer your question, Bill, that actually it's not the school district that is getting losing out on this.
You just hit on something that is a curiosity of mine, because the thing that stands out on this whole issue is the naming part. And I know they have to keep memorial in the title. That's part of it. But could you say that again? Who gets the rights to name it? And the developer, right? But can they sell that off?
I believe,
is that how they would make money?
I believe that, I hope I'm not committing an error on live radio.
Sorry.
I believe that's the case. I believe that it's part of that, they can sell naming rights.
So we could end up with like Starbucks Memorial, Molly Moon's
Olive
Memorial,
Oil Arena.
Olive Oil Arena. Yeah. Olieto Arena.
Don't get me started on that translation.
Okay. Olive oil in a moment. Just hang tight. So the stadium is a memorial to the Seattle school alums who died in World War II. So are we tearing down a memorial to dead children to what? To make it prettier, to attract the World Cup? What?
I think part of it, the idea is that the memorial would have to stay or be maintained somehow. But I think that a lot is still left to be determined depending on what proposals they get in.
You mean that wall will have to be maintained?
Yes.
Because the wall came later. I mean, it was, the stadium itself was built as a memorial, and then a few years, 3 or 4 years later, they added the wall.
Not all historical projects are created equal.
Okay.
Like this is not a pretty stadium.
I'm just saying, maybe a memorial shouldn't be something that grows ugly, that grows decrepit like a stadium. That's what we have walls and plaques for, right?
That was kind of my point, speaking to some folks earlier, was we could turn this statement on its head and say, instead of saying this was a memorial, it's supposed to be for, these students in World War II, we could say, this is a memorial. It's supposed to be for the students who died in World War II. Why are we letting it do this? The argument could come around and say we need to do something that lives up to that honor.
Oh, we should make it more beautiful because it's a memorial.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's fair. What else should we know? They're going to choose a proposal. They say in May. That seems incredibly fast.
According to the timeline I just laid out, going back to, there's like deals in 2009, 2017, and 21. May would be like a warp speed. So, the other issue is, I mentioned sort of the downtown school. I don't know if the Seattle School District wants a downtown school right now. I don't think they need one. They're in the process of looking at severe budget cuts, and I think there's we saw other school districts around the area, they're closing schools. So I don't know how that partnership, how that yoking of those two interests still works.
Okay, a couple more items on Week in Review before we're done. Some political news this week. We have a governor serving his third term. No one's ever served 4 in Washington. There are a few Democrats who'd like to take over. One of them, the county executive, King County Executive Dow Constantine, said this week he's not running. Is that because A, Constantine is passionate about King County, as he says, B, he can't win, C, he knows Jay Inslee is planning to run again and hasn't said so.
There was an interesting bit in the Seattle Times where I think it was Jim Bruner or whoever was writing the story was saying that Dow did say that he got this impression from Inslee he might run again. And I was like, oh my, really? But I think there might be a little bit of saving face from Dow there, because it's like the same day or so that he said, oh, to supporters, I'm not going to run for governor, that my heart is with King County or whatever. There was like a really left-leaning poll from a left-leaning group that was like saying he would only get like 7% of the vote or something. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, he's not polling well. I'm sure he has internal polls that show something similar. I don't know. Timing was a little interesting.
In that same poll, Hillary Franz, whose name's also being thrown out there, got the exact same, I think, percentage, 7% or so. And so far, she's saying, I'm honored and I'm thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, and Bob Ferguson got triple that.
Yeah, exactly.
21%. So
that's the state attorney general.
I kind of wondered at this point if it were Bob Ferguson and Dow Constantine were running for governor, if Bob Ferguson might win King County. I don't know if Bob Ferguson might have a better name in King County than Dow.
I mean, he was on the King County Council before, right? Am I right about that? Yeah, he was a King County politician before even doing state level, and state level politicians do have better name recognition. And he's still riding this wave from 2017 where he like took down Trump's travel ban in the media, right? And like sewed over it. And so that was where he got a lot of his sort of momentum. And then Inslee announced he's running for a third term and everyone just stewed for like years more. And now the fourth term, I just don't see it, but whatever, fine.
Do you feel that would rub voters the wrong way running? I mean, as much as if you supported Inslee in the past, a fourth term just might be just a bad flavor.
Yeah, we'd never have a president of the U.S. who's that old, would we?
I mean, Inslee is 72. There are older politicians, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a reason why term limits is an issue that doesn't always totally go away, because there actually is good arguments for getting rid of people as you're, particularly in the executive branch after some time. You think about you coming into office with the energy and the backing of a smart group of people behind you, and you're into your third or fourth term, and those people have mostly melted away. You look at the folks that were in Inslee's first couple terms, everybody's gone. The Dow Constantine also had an executive team around him. Pretty much everybody's gone. And so the problem with that is you see problems accrete over time. The executive functions of the job get harder and harder. You see this year, Dow Constantine is dealing with really kind of mismanagement of the jail. My colleague Sidney Brownstone has really kind of torn that up. You've got, Mike Lindblom just wrote about how Metro Transit basically neglected the downtown Sound Transit stations for so long. Sound Transit now had to go in and the escalators never work now because Metro didn't maintain them over time. You've got anyway. There's just sort of these administrative problems that kind of build, and I think that there is a reason why term limits.
Even if I wanted to mount a defense of Dow Constantine, I wouldn't have time because we're coming toward the end of Week in Review, and we haven't talked about olive oil in our coffee. So and I want to know what, if anything, made you smile this week. So, Melissa, as of this week, we can drink olive oil in our Starbucks coffee. You tried it. How delicious is it?
I'm really kind of against this. The Starbucks people are very nice. They're very sweet. Like the person who put this together, these drinks, was talking to me about it. And I'm like, as I'm drinking them. I just don't think they're two things that go together. Like Howard Schultz, who now is no longer the CEO of Starbucks as of a few days ago. There's two Italian great traditions and they should be together. It's but why? Olive oil is great. Coffee is great. Why do they need to merge?
It's the Mediterranean diet.
But it's why do we need to upgrade to make everything triple Italian-esque or something?
Can I ask what drink you got?
I tried 5. That was a whole situation. I will say that if you want to just kind of try it, the cafe latte that's warm is the least problematic, I would say, of the ones, because when you have olive oil in a cold drink, which most of them are cold drinks, it just it's so strong to me, even though they used a fairly mild olive oil compared to what I tried to whip up at home to kind of approximate it a few weeks earlier. but it's a mild olive oil, but you just still taste it so strong in a cold drink. At the same time, I went and got a normal latte, like right next door from Starbucks headquarters, right after with oat milk, which is what they use. And it was just like so much better than the one that had olive oil in it. Like, it's just like, this was okay-ish, but it's like, okay, just get the freaking.
Can I use this question? Why?
Yeah, that's what I don't understand.
Why olive oil in coffee? Why?
They're trying to do a health thing, kind of. It's like
Mediterranean diet.
I have why they're doing with oat milk too, because it's like people want healthy, and I'm like, but like all these things together, just is like, why?
I have a suspicion that might be the answer, and the answer is the unicorn drink, or the fruitcake frappuccino, or the chili mocha. It seems that every few years, Starbucks cranks out something that garners headlines, gets us all to talk about it. Curiously go in and have them brew the cup, and maybe it comes back, maybe it goes the way of Crystal Pepsi, but I ever since this came out and they talked about Howard Schultz going through Italy and sipping spoonfuls of olive oil and said, maybe I'll put this in my coffee, and before screaming Olietto, and then it just felt like branding up and down and marketing left and right. I just kind of get that impression from
and
it.
like I love that they're like oleato means with oil. I'm like, so I speak a little bit of Italian. It's like the only time you really use oleato with an E is if it's like wax paper, carta oleata. And I'm just like, okay, cool. I actually pulled some of my Italian friends on this being like, what do you think? And they were like universally like fastivo, like which means like gross. It's disgusting. So I don't know. All right.
Have you ever had bulletproof coffee?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. And I
drink
don't love
those.
that.
Yeah.
But the thing
Is
is
that with butter or?
butter mixes in better than olive oil.
Yeah.
It just does. I mean, yeah, oil and water. It's a problem.
Adding fats to coffee is not new. That's what cream is. Butter is similar. I put coconut oil in my coffees before. I've done the bulletproof coffee, which also has a similar branding. The founder was hiking through the Himalayas and was so cold, and someone gave him yak butter, and he's like, "Oh my gosh!" And now we have bulletproof coffee. All branding, but olive oil, I tried it. Like, I mixed it in with my coffee, and it just didn't hit the same way other fats do when you add them.
It's just a strong flavor, as long as it's just a very strong flavor. You can't get around that. And then you just have like this vegetable, the aftertaste hits you. If you're like, oh, this is kind of okay. And then you're like, oh, that is a bunch of olive oil in coffee, like right afterward. It's like, ooh.
Okay. I don't like to say this because Dyer has aptly pointed out that I'm kind of being a stooge just by bringing this up on the air. That's fair. Number one, I thought it sounded gross when I heard. Number two, I thought it sounded like Olestra, the fat substitute best known for anal leakage. Right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about. That's true. Look it up. I made it at home yesterday. Now, granted, I just had a packet of Via for camping, in my camping case. I made black coffee. I poured what was in my cupboard. I didn't like the sheen on top, the oily sheen.
And the ice shaken coffee. I didn't put this in my review because I was trying to be a little bit like nice and also word count, but it has it kind of, there's a layer that shows up with one of the iced coffees. Like, it's not great.
Shiny
All of
coffee.
that said, number one, we love restaurants because they put in the amount of oil we secretly want. We love oil. Why are we so grossed out? Like, why do we say oily as an insult when we love oil?
Well, it has to blend in the thing, man. It can't, I mean, if it's like, a broken sauce, or something where the fat separates, it's kind of gross. You know what I mean? Like, that's not usually a good thing. But if
you're right. And olive oil is a healthy oil. It's something we should probably use in place of a lot of the other oils. So from here on out, I'm using oily as a positive.
As a positive.
Describe things are oily.
Because we do, let's admit it. We say that potato chips are salty and candy is sweet, even though we know it's not good for us. Yeah. But we don't say this pad thai is delightfully oily. But that's why the restaurant's full of people, because we love oil.
Yeah.
And what I'm building to is that, to my surprise, as gross sounding as I thought it was, I actually kind of enjoyed my olive oil coffee.
Right. I will say, so this health thing with the Starbucks thing, they literally are putting like gelato basically on some of these drinks on top. Like, one of them is like literally, I don't know, they have this like foam thing they do now, which I didn't even know about, but it's like literally like gelato mixed with the olive oil. So it's like, how healthy are we being with this? Really? Okay, fine. But yeah, I mean, like, I accept that some people may like it. I find the flavors not complimentary.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, we've got 2 minutes left in the show. I want to leave you something to smile about. I'll begin and go through this fast. There's something comforting in ritual to me, because we're always covering what's new on Week in Review. But I kind of like ritual, especially when it's poop related. And if you're new to the Puget Sound region, that's a second poop reference, by the way, in the last 5 minutes. If you're new to here, you don't know that every spring Woodland Park Zoo sells compost from giraffe crap and zebras and hippos and the bedding in their cages, and the zoo's compost manager makes a show of it.
I am the Prince of Poo, the Emperor of Excrement, Third World Leader, the GM of BM, the Master of Microbes, the Duke of Dung.
And I know these are dad jokes, but every year when you have the captain of Caca presiding over the Fecal Fest, and it's good for your garden and the circle of life, there's something reassuring until you notice that animals are in cages producing this stuff. Granted, but that made me smile that Zudu is back. Anybody else?
I'm starting raised bed gardens, so I'm glad that you brought that up.
Use it.
Real quick, I guess this week was the 100th birthday of Marcel Marceau. He would have been 100 years old this week. And if you don't know who that is, go check out some old Marcel Marceau. He's one of the world's most famous mimes, and he always brings a smile. And then you learn his story and learn that the first time he started miming was when he was helping save Jewish children from concentration camps and needed to help them be quiet. And so he did that during World War II. He was helping people get to neutral territory. So it'll bring a smile to your face. Happy birthday, Marcel Marceau.
Good stuff.
My goodness, you have a lot more deep stuff than I do.
No
over here.
Well, we only have 45 seconds.
I'm find another.
I'm just amused by that. I'm trying to teach my 3-year-old to ride a bike, and he keeps stopping to pick wildflowers, which is kind of adorable, but like also not bike riding. But okay, cool.
Yeah, daffodils are up for your kid.
Very cute.
Yeah,
I'll embrace the unadulterated fun of March Madness. I've been watching a ton of basketball, including a great game last night with Gonzaga. And UCLA.
Yeah.
That was absolutely a blast, and for me, very much not work and a total different headspace.
Yeah, Gonzaga advances to the Elite Eight. Good luck. And thank you for coming. Thanks for being a great show. KUOW's Dyer Oxley, Seattle Times Investigations Editor Jonathan Martin, Axios Seattle reporter Melissa Santos. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you to producer Kevin Kniestead, to Juan Pablo Chiquiza, Tio Popescu, Bernard Ouellet running the board, and we'll see you again a week from